You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 106. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm thrilled to have you here with me this week. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Whenever it is that you're listening to this podcast episode, I hope you are doing so well. And if you happen to be feeling stuck or you think you may be feeling stuck, welcome. This podcast episode is for you. Today, we're talking about 5 signs that you may be stuck and perhaps more importantly, how you can overcome that stuckness. Now, before we dive in, I wanted to share an announcement with you. As you may know, if you've been listening to this podcast, then you'll be aware that I have been running a group program for women lawyers that started about 5 months ago. We're just wrapping up month 5 and our final month 6 is about to unfold in June. The reason I mention this is because starting in July, I'm going to start another group program. Now, if you are interested, then you'll want to join me for a free webinar that I'll be holding on June 15th. It's a Thursday at noon Pacific time. Now, even if you're not interested in joining for the group program, I would encourage you and I invite you to sign up for this webinar. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to do a mid-year check-in and a recalibration of any goals that you may have set earlier in the year, or you may be setting those goals for the first time. So I would love for you to join me. The information to register will be attached to the show notes for this episode on thejoyfulpractice.com website. If you can't find it, send me an email or a note on LinkedIn. I'll send you the registration information. It is a wonderful time. It'll be an hour of your time to just reflect and recalibrate and set goals for yourself. Perhaps, thinking about today's topic, perhaps goals that might get you unstuck from a place where you are right now. Now, in that webinar, I will be taking you through a process to recalibrate and set your goals. And I will also spend a few minutes talking about how you can sign up for the next round of the group program that I'm offering. And it has been such a pleasure. This is the first 6-month program that I have offered. It has been way more amazing than I even could have imagined. I have 8 of the most incredible women lawyers from across Canada who are in this group. I adore them. We meet about twice a month. We've also had a couple of bonus call sessions to address specific topics. If you're interested, I will share with you very briefly right now what we have covered. We started out in January by setting goals for the program. In February, we moved on to self-concept. So figuring out who we need to be the person that achieves the goals that we set for ourselves. In March, we moved on to the next topic, which was obstacles. So for every individual, whenever you set a goal, what you'll notice is that the obstacles will start to appear in your way. And what is so fascinating about obstacles is that they are unique to you. And we then learn skills and strategies to understand and then overcome those obstacles. So that was March. In April, we talked about confidence, authority, and power, and how to bring more of those into your practice. This month, May, we talked about boundaries, which generated some of the richest discussions we had as a group. Boundaries are a topic that resonate with so many of us. And so having an opportunity to talk about them, to brainstorm about how to set them, talk about some of the implications that come when we do decide to set boundaries. Those are really incredible discussions. And then next month, we will talk about sustainable growth. So if you're interested in these topics, I would love for you to reach out to me with any questions that you have. And in particular, join us for our webinar, which will be on June 15th. It's a Thursday at noon Pacific time. I should also mention that during the program, I offered 2 individual coaching sessions per lawyer who enrolled in the program, one at the beginning and one at the end. So that initial meeting was often used to help fix the goal. And then the later session was really dealing with obstacles that came up in relation to that goal. So those are also aspects of the group coaching program. And then I mentioned there were a couple of bonus classes that we threw into the program. I shouldn't say threw into the program. I created them within the program, specifically tailored to the group that we just had. We had one session on time management. This is something that comes up often in a legal practice, and I have lots of ideas and strategies for how to manage your time productively to help you reach your goals. We also had a session on transitions, because whether you are transitioning into leadership or transitioning into a new job or some other type of transition, understanding how transitions work and having a framework for that can be really helpful. So once again, I'll be offering a group program starting in July. It is for women lawyers. The group this round that we just had was all Canadian lawyers, but you don't have to be in Canada. If you're outside of Canada and you're interested, please do let me know. Now, with that, I am going to dive into today's session, which is ideal for anybody who is feeling stuck or who thinks that maybe they are feeling stuck. And I was inspired to create this podcast episode in part because it's a topic that comes up quite a bit in coaching conversations. Some lawyers that I speak with are really in that stage of stuckness. It is a tricky place to be because on the one hand, you know you're not happy where you are. And on the other hand, there's a lot of resistance against moving forward. So I hope that if you can relate to that, if you're in a phase where you're feeling stuck, that what we talk about today will help you start inching your way forward. Another reason that I wanted to talk about stuckness is that last week I recorded a podcast episode where I talked about having a stressful week. And one of the strategies that I offered was to not spend time doing things that do not move you closer to your goal. And one of the things that I recommended not doing is complaining. And when I finished recording the episode and I was thinking about it over the course of the week, I thought, that is kind of a harsh thing to say, do not complain. It's not productive. I think we all know that. And yet sometimes we do complain. And I can assure you, I do my fair share of complaining. I am not 100% complaint free. I do try to minimize it. I try to be aware of it, but I still complain. And what I thought would be really helpful would be to address what the source might be. If you do find yourself complaining a lot, instead of thinking, oh gosh, Paula said, don't complain, it's bad. That's not what I wanted to say at all. Instead, what I'd prefer for us to look at is what is the source of the complaining? What is causing it? And can we resolve an underlying problem that is leading to the complaint? So I'm foreshadowing a little bit in terms of what you're going to hear, but those are a couple of reasons why I was motivated and inspired to address the topic of being stuck. So we're going to dive right in. The problem, of course, that we are looking to solve is that feeling of stuckness. Now, what are the signs? I mentioned there were 5 signs that you may be stuck. What are they? Well, the ones that I'm going to talk about in today's podcast episode are as follows. Number 1, you complain a lot. Yep, we just foreshadowed that one. If you find yourself complaining, sometimes it starts out like little soft whispers, maybe a nudge here or there, a soft expression of dissatisfaction. And from there, it builds almost like a snowball to the point that it is a regular complaint. You get tired of hearing yourself say the same words over and over. The situation doesn't really seem to change, but your feelings toward it only get stronger and more negative. Maybe this is something that you've noticed with other people. Often it's easier to spot when somebody else in our lives is complaining and we are listening to the complaints and we think to ourselves, oh, this is not the first time that I've heard this story. This story seems to keep repeating itself over and over and over again. It's easy to see in others. It's not as easy to see in ourselves. But at some point, You may recognize yourself in a complaint pattern where you think, oh, this is not good. I realize that this situation keeps coming up. I keep complaining about it, and yet I haven't really done anything to solve it. So, or maybe you've tried to solve it and it's not actually working. You're not getting any traction. Another sign that you might be stuck is if you find yourself opinion shopping. So this might be wrapped up in the complaining. You might find that you're unhappy about something, and so you start seeking out the opinions of others, maybe looking for some sort of validation or some reflection that you're not crazy for having this particular complaint. You might find that you're out there asking for permission. This is actually something that I feel some clients come to me for. It's almost like they come to me, they know what they want to do, and they want me to be the one to give them the permission to do what it is that they want to do, whether it's leaving their job, whether it's having a difficult conversation, whether it's deciding that they want to transition out of law altogether. So you might find yourself seeking permission. The next telltale sign, procrastination. This is a big one. Procrastination comes up in all sorts of different ways in a practice, a legal practice, and frankly, outside of your practice. Where it shows up when you're stuck, it can show up in relation to the thing where you are stuck. So let's say you are unhappy in your job and you want to leave your job. What you might do is push off taking any proactive steps to getting out of your job. You might tell yourself, if you're a litigator, for example, well, there's a trial coming up in 6 months and I just want to make it through the end of the trial. Then I will look for another job. Maybe there's a bonus coming your way. Maybe there's a big event coming your way. Maybe you are about to go on mat leave. Maybe you have a vacation coming up. Maybe. So there's always something that you can identify that is on the future horizon that you decide will become the bench point, the timestamp where you will then take action. But when that time comes, then what you find is instead of taking action, there's another event that has materialized. And so you keep pushing off your timeline. So that might be a way of procrastinating. Another way that procrastination can show up is when you start to really lose inertia. Well, sorry, you're not losing inertia, you're gaining inertia. When you start finding that you lose motivation, that you feel like you're slowing down, that you feel sluggish, sometimes because you are so stuck in one area of your life, you start to lose energy and focus in other areas of your life. And you may find that you start procrastinating on routine tasks or things that you wouldn't normally be procrastinating on. So to summarize, the 5 signs that we're going to be talking about today, the 5 indicia that you may be stuck are: number 1, you complain a lot. Number 2, you find yourself opinion shopping. Number 3, you find yourself seeking permission. Number 4, you find yourself procrastinating. And my apologies, the 5th one, I haven't addressed this one yet, is that you may notice that your predominant emotions are negative ones. And by negative, I mean emotions that we typically associate with feeling badly. So fear is one of them. If you're thinking about leaving your job, for example, you might feel paralyzed by fear of what would happen if you were to leave. You might feel dread if what you're trying to do is recalibrate a relationship that you have with a colleague or recalibrate something to do in your practice. You may feel a lot of dread if you have been trying to make a change, but it's not working and you find yourself doing work that you don't enjoy in an environment that doesn't feel good to you anymore. You might feel frustrated. So this last indicia is that you may find that you increasingly feel dread, fear, anxiety, and those are all feelings that we typically think of as being those negative emotions. Now, if you are reaching a point, or if you feel stuck already, then what I'd invite you to consider is that this is completely normal. It is not a sign that anything has gone wrong or that there's anything wrong with you. I will share that my theory on this is that we as humans are all hardwired for growth. Yes, we are all hardwired for growth. That means personal growth. That means professional growth. And as you grow, you change. And what we know about change is that it is often very uncomfortable. You can imagine if your feet never stopped growing and you were trying to fit your feet into the same pair of shoes, you would be okay for a while until the point where your toes are literally pressed up against the edge of your shoes. Your toes start kind of curling under. It gets really hard to walk. Next thing you know, you're kind of cutting holes in the sides of your shoes so that you can walk, until finally you just have to admit to yourself, these shoes no longer fit. It's time for me to get a new pair of shoes. And this is kind of a silly example, but it's a visual. It's a visceral visual example of what it can feel like, or what it would feel like if you were to physically outgrow your shoes. And you might think of that same pain if you are in a situation, whether it's a professional workplace, whether it's professional relationships, whether it's something completely outside of work, personal relationships, anything where you have outgrown a particular situation to the point that it becomes unbearable for you. And on the one hand, you really want to leave. You really want to find something new. You want to make a transition. On the other hand, you're clinging to the safety of what you associate with being where you are right now. So if you're feeling stuck, it's completely normal. Now, we are primarily focused on work here in this particular podcast and in general, and in this episode. So some examples where I see lawyers get stuck. Well, career plateau is one of them. So you might find that you are advancing, right? You go through law school, you go through articles, you go through your first few years as an associate. Maybe you make income partner, maybe you make equity partner. There are all these different stages in a typical law firm. Now, if you're outside of a law firm, there may be other titles and milestones within your career. I picked law firm because it's an example that is relatable, one we can easily identify with. And so what you might find is that you go from one position to the next position, and maybe you reach a stage in your career where you've reached a plateau. There's no room for you to move forward. And what you start to feel is a bit bored. You might feel a lack of engagement. You might reach the milestones and find that you're nonetheless increasingly disengaged with the nature of your work. You find it's no longer exciting and engaging and interesting to you, and you may lose sight of where you're going. And so that can have the effect of feeling like you're a little bit adrift, right? It's almost like they use that term when you're sailing in the doldrums. Believe me, I'm not a sailor. I've experimented a few times. I'm not particularly talented at it. But being in the doldrums is literally when you're in a sailboat and you find yourself with no wind. Your sails are catching no wind. They might flutter a little bit, but you're literally stuck and drifting. You can get into the career doldrums if there's no longer momentum either pushing you ahead or pulling you forward. Another area where you might find you get stuck is if you reach a milestone. Let's say you've been working really hard toward a particular milestone and you finally succeed and you get there. And when you get there, what you find is that it's not what you thought it would be. And you've worked so hard to get there. And now you don't see the payoff and you are wondering what to do next. It may be that you've outgrown your role. So you might be in a position where it's very lockstep, or it's not an environment like a law firm, for example, where there is a continual ladder. Some organizations have particular roles that you can be in, but within that particular organization, there's no direct path upward, and you may find yourself in that type of working environment. Sometimes it's because of the size of the organization. Maybe you're in-house, for example, and you're at the top of where you could go in-house, or maybe there is a further position ahead of you, but there's one position and it's filled by somebody who just accepted that position. And so the chances that you will be promoted to that position are quite low. And if you were to be promoted, it would take a lot of time to get there. So this is really thinking about you being in a position where you don't see yourself being able to advance, and you start to feel like you've outgrown where you are. You're not quite ready, or that next step is not available. And so you can again start to feel stuck. You might outgrow relationships. So again, looking at not just your professional relationships, but there may be professional relationships where once upon a time you felt very aligned with your colleagues, with your clients, and maybe now you've fallen out of alignment with them. Similarly, you might find this in your personal life. So you might find there are relationships there, whether it's friendships, whether it's other types of relationships where you've simply developed interests that have kind of had the result of you growing apart. And so you may be drifting there as well. That can make you feel stuck. Do you stay in those relationships or do you move on? You might also find that your external circumstances change. So for a lot of lawyers, myself included, when you have a family, when you have children of your own, that can be a huge change that overnight has the effect of turning your priorities upside down, literally, and your ability to be available upside down. And it may create a recalibration of what you want out of your work. It may be that there are changes within your organization. So it may be that the person that you are working for all of a sudden moves on to a different organization and you've stayed where you are. And so the dynamic has shifted considerably, and maybe you don't like that new dynamic. It doesn't resonate with you. It may be that you're in a particular practice area where the law has changed. I've seen that happen a few times. And what you might decide is that, you know what, this new way of practicing really does not align with me anymore. And you may be forced to either adapt to that practice area as it now appears, or find a new practice area altogether. So that last example then being that the stuckness is because something changed outside of yourself, and now you're feeling like it's no longer a good fit. So what do you do when you are in this state of stuckness? Well, going through each of the 5 signs that I have identified, I'll give you a run through of what you may be trying already. So if you are complaining a lot, what you might find is that the complaining itself offers this sense of temporary relief. It might actually feel productive because you've got all this energy behind it, because you're articulating what makes a lot of sense to you. And on some level, the complaining might be a way for you to process the information, to better understand what it is that you're experiencing. But as long as your complaining is going to individuals who are outside of the immediate problem, who are not in a position to help you resolve that particular problem, the complaining basically doesn't move the needle forward. In terms of opinion shopping, it might be that you are out seeking validation. You are out there asking others for their opinion on what you should do. You might be trying to gather information. You might be looking for a sign, right? If everybody agrees with me, then it must mean that this is a sign that I should move on. But ultimately, as long as you are out there looking for other people's opinions, other people's validation, chances are you're not actually making any progress toward solving the problem. You're not getting any less stuck. If you're seeking permission from somebody else, I mean, I know I have certainly been there when I was making the transition from lawyer to lawyer coach. I know I wanted permission from somebody. And I think I've told the story on the podcast before, where there was a speaker who was going to be in town. Well, actually not in town, in Seattle. And I was trying to convince a friend of mine to go down to Seattle with me to see the speaker. And she asked me, she said, Paula, why is it that you are so keen to drive all the way down to Seattle to see the speaker? And I knew the moment that she asked me the question that the answer was because I thought somehow this person could give me permission to stop being a lawyer and start being a coach. That's what it felt like to me. I also kind of asked people, what do you think of this? I did all these things. I did the complaining. I did the opinion shopping and the seeking permission. Is this right? And so you might find yourself there where you're just trying to find somebody out there who can give you permission to do something. And again, what's happening here is that you're effectively trying to give someone else authority so that you don't have to take responsibility for the decision and the consequences that might flow from that decision. But it doesn't actually get you any closer to resolving the problem. When it comes to procrastination, well, you might try, right? What is happening there? You are putting things off. And the more that you're putting things off, you may be having a sense of relief in the short term. But again, it doesn't actually move you any closer toward getting unstuck. And then finally, if you are experiencing these negative emotions and you might be trying to deal with them by kind of finding ways to distract yourself from those emotions. Maybe it's distraction through entertainment or, avoiding the problem, or shopping or snacking or avoiding, whatever that happens to be, you're not addressing what it is that is actually causing those emotions. And there's a wonderful book called The Untethered Soul. It is written by a gentleman named Michael Singer. And in that book, he talks about having a thorn, right? If you have a thorn in your arm, what you can do is try to build your life to protect yourself from the pain of that thorn getting bumped into or pressed, right? You can imagine having a thorn in your arm and it hurts. And every time you bump it, it hurts even more. And so you might build up a cast around it. You might avoid going into crowds. You might always protect and cradle your arm so that the thorn doesn't actually get pressed on. But of course, it's a fairly limiting way to live your life, and it doesn't resolve the problem. And so similarly, if what you're finding is you have these negative emotions, you're feeling a lot of fear, you're feeling a lot of anxiety, and instead of dealing with the thorn, right, the cause of all of this, whether it's that you're in the wrong job or you need to set some boundaries, you need to have a conversation, you need to end a professional relationship, whatever that looks like, if you don't take out that thorn, you're constantly protecting, but you're not solving the problem. So these strategies, not surprisingly, don't work because, again, you're basically getting some form of relief. You're getting a bit of short-term relief, right? By kind of venting, by opinion shopping, by trying to find someone who will tell you what to do. All of these things bring some temporary relief, but you're not dealing with the elephant in the room. So those complaints that started out as whispers, you might think of those and how they get louder and louder because as you ignore the underlying problem, it just keeps getting bigger. So if you imagine that as the elephant in the room, maybe it starts out, it's like this cute little pink baby elephant and it's making cute little baby elephant noises. And if you ignore it and it keeps growing and you keep feeding it, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger until next thing you know, you've got a giant elephant. It's loud, it's stomping around, and it wants to be let out of its cage or whatever it is that is containing it. And so that is when you reach somewhat of a tipping point and finally take action. And so what I would offer you, what we're going to focus on is some ideas for solutions to help you address the problem of stuckness by dealing with each of these factors or indicia one at a time. First, we're going to start with this idea of complaining. Now, if what you find is that you are complaining quite a bit and you are complaining about the same topic over and over and over again, what I'm going to recommend here is number one, please do not judge yourself for complaining. Let all judgment go. We don't need to add a layer of you shouldn't be complaining on top of their complaining. Let's just take a step back and look at what the complaining actually is. And what I would invite you to do is to start listening to yourself. You may be out there speaking to others. They may be listening to you. They may have stopped listening to you, but are you listening to yourself? So the first step is if you are complaining, find out what is really going on. So for example, let's say that you're having problems at work. Let's say that you are complaining about your job. I would invite you to write out exactly what it is that you're complaining about. Maybe you're complaining about your hours. Maybe you're complaining about one of the colleagues that you have who you work with. Maybe you have a client, whether it's an internal client or an external client. You have a really difficult relationship working with that person. I would invite you to get it all out, maybe even write it out on paper. That would be ideal. And then to ask yourself what the problem really is. What you might find is that it is a situation that is just no longer aligned. The job that you're in just isn't the job for you. It may also be that the job itself is okay, but it's your way of managing that job. Maybe you need to put some boundaries into place. Maybe you need to have some conversations. Maybe you need to clarify what role is your role, what role belongs to other people. So what I'd invite you to do is to take the complaining and to figure out what it is that really lies at the heart of the complaining and what the real problem is. That's number one. Number two is opinion shopping. So if what you find is that you are out there opinion shopping, what I would invite you to do is to figure out what opinions you're actually seeking. So for example, one of the opinions you might be asking is it okay for me to leave my job? Another opinion might be, is it normal for me to feel this way? Another opinion might be, will I outgrow this phase of my practice, or will it always be like this? You might be thinking, what job would be well suited for me? So I have lawyers who reach out to me who they think they want a different job, and they want me to basically diagnose them, to ask them a few questions and say, well, you may be a private practice lawyer, but clearly you were designed to go in-house, or clearly you were designed not to be a lawyer. You would be better off as an HR consultant. And what I'm offering in this podcast episode is that it is really hard for somebody else to take you and understand you better than you could understand yourself and make a recommendation. Someone can make that recommendation. I know there are tests out there that test your aptitudes, test your strengths, test your interests, and then spit out a list of jobs that would probably be good jobs for you. But I question how effective those tools are, in the sense that for each of us who has been qualified as a lawyer, what we know about being a lawyer is that it's so different depending on the nature of your work. And even within the practice of law, let's say whether you're a litigator or a solicitor, whether you're in tax or employment or family, in each of these different categories, you can still have very different practices, even if the title is pretty much the same. So what I'm getting at here is, if you're out there opinion shopping and you're asking other people for their opinion, the challenge here is that you're not necessarily able to get better information from someone else than you could get from yourself. And so what I recommend doing here is to figure out what questions you're asking, right? What are the opinions that you are seeking? Is it normal? Is it okay? And then I would invite you to play with how you would want to also frame that question. So you might take an if question, a yes, no question, and turn it into a more open-ended question. So for example, instead of, is it okay to leave my job? Maybe the question becomes, what would it look like if I left my job? Or instead of, is it normal to feel this way? The question might become, how do I want to feel in my job? Will I outgrow this phase of my practice? What do I want the next phase of my practice to look like? So take your opinion questions, write them down, and then also look at what other types of questions you might form based on those initial questions. Then what I would invite you to do is, instead of going out into the world and asking other people to answer those questions for you, I'd invite you to ask yourself those questions and do your best to answer them. So what that might look like is consulting your inner board of directors. I don't know if you have one of those. I sometimes have an inner board of directors. The idea there is to identify, perhaps in your mind's eye, a list of people who you admire. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 individuals in your life, and you might pretend that they are all sitting around a table and that you're asking each of them what the answer is to one of these questions. And yes, in a sense, you're externalizing it because you are asking somebody who is outside of you. But what you're actually doing here is you're channeling your own wisdom. So for example, if one member of your board of directors is somebody who is a sage in your eyes, somebody who's always thinking about the big picture, who tends to be really thoughtful and insightful with the way they analyze questions, and you tap into that energy through imagining what that person would say, you are still channeling your own inner wisdom, even if you're attaching someone else to that wisdom. So again, one way to answer your own question is to create a board of directors, an internal board of directors. Another option for this is to imagine your future self. So you get to pick the timeline that you decide to use. You could be well into your 90s, or you might pick your future self who is 5 years ahead of you, who has already dealt with the question that you're grappling with right now. And you ask that future version of yourself the answer to these questions. And what that does is, again, it allows you to have perspective on the question, and it allows you to channel what you already know to be true about yourself and the situation. So that is step 2. So in terms of solutions, in terms of complaining, we have offered, or I have offered, that number 1, you listen to yourself and figure out what the real problem is. Number 2 is, when you're opinion shopping, you want to get really clear on what questions you're asking, what opinions you are seeking, and then answer those questions for yourself. The third is seeking permission. Now, the beautiful thing about seeking permission is that whenever I've been asked permission for something, it seems so clear to me from the outside looking in what that person should do. So if somebody comes to me and they ask me a question like, can I leave my job? Or in my case, is it okay to leave the practice of law and become a coach? Or what I see sometimes in my practice is, should I tell them that? And in that case, it's sometimes that a person that I'm working with wants to disclose something that they think is important, but they're nervous about doing that. And it's so interesting because within the question, I can see the answer. And it's so clear from the person outside looking in, but it's not as clear for the person who's on the inside. So what I invite you to think about is, if you are seeking permission, write down the question. I think it's always helpful to gain objectivity when we see the question in writing in front of our own eyes, and ask yourself whether the answer is already in the question. And I think a lot of the time you will find that it is. Now, the next area where I have some suggestions to offer is procrastination. So again, if you find that you're procrastinating, it might be that low level, in all areas procrastination where the lack of motivation has seeped into other areas of your practice. So that might be a challenge. It may also be that procrastination in taking action toward the specific goal. So for example, you want a new job, but you just don't feel ready to take any steps. So here, what I would offer are a couple of ideas. Number one, I think sometimes you actually do need to allow your stuckness to mature and ripen. So if you think of that elephant, when it's a baby, tiny elephant, there's a period where you're questioning, right? The elephant is growing a little bit here and there, but it's not really a problem yet. Same thing if you did have magical feet that don't stop growing, there will be that initial phase where you're not really sure. Like, are your feet getting bigger? Are your shoes actually getting too small? And it could go either way. In theory, it really could go either way. And what happens is that ultimately you reach a tipping point. And the tipping point is when it becomes clear that you must move forward. Now, the tipping point can come because you realize with 100% certainty, or as close to that as you can get, that you've made a decision and that you're going to move forward. In that case, you are effectively getting ahead of the tipping point. What can also happen is sometimes that decision gets made for you. So for example, if you're in a situation, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a work situation where you're really not invested and you're not showing up 100%. And ultimately what happens is someone else makes that decision for you. I consider that to be a form of self-sabotage because in a sense, you've created that situation. You aren't the one to pull the trigger, but at an unconscious level, you may have been the one to set up that situation. So what I would recommend here is to pay attention. You might be okay with that outcome, but I would invite you to be conscious about what you are doing and what is actually happening. Now, when you decide, or if you're getting close to that stage where you think you have made a decision, you're not necessarily in those early stages, you're beyond the whispers, but you haven't quite reached a full-blown decision yet, what I would invite you to do is to start doing anything that moves you in the right direction, starting with very small steps. So for example, let's say you have a practice and it is a total mess. Let's say you've got clutter all over your desk. You've got timelines that you have lost track of. You've got a stack of papers. You don't even know what's there. You've got unopened mail, whatever that happens to look like. If you are feeling disorganized, I would recommend starting with one very discrete task. Maybe it's tidying up the papers on your desk. Maybe it's going in and filing emails from the last week. Maybe it's creating a list of the files that you have. So you want to start with something that is small because that will give you a quick win and you'll start to feel progress. You might even start with something that you're going to see a lot. If you're a visual person like me, it does help to have something that you're going to notice it right away. That clean desk is a sign to yourself that you are moving forward. If, for example, you want to leave your job, maybe you want to create a fresh document to build your CV. Maybe you copy and paste your old CV into that document and start updating some of the sections one at a time. Maybe you call a recruiter. Maybe you create a short list of 5 people that you want to reach out to and then send a single email. If you're in a work relationship that isn't going in the right direction, maybe you set a single boundary. Maybe you inch your way closer to something that is true for you. So what I'd encourage you to think about here is that you want to take action that is aligned with the unstuckness, right? You want to look to where you're going, where you want to go, and give yourself one little action, because when you take that action, then you get that win, you get that burst of dopamine, you get that feel-good hormone running through your body, and you think, okay, I could do that. What else can I do? Finally, the last indicia, the last clue that you are stuck is those prevalent negative emotions, the fear, the dread, the overwhelm, the frustration. And so what I would recommend to do here is to identify which of those feelings you are experiencing and then allow them to be there. Instead of trying to distract yourself and do something else, just let them be there and ask yourself, what are these emotions trying to tell me? Then what I'd encourage you to do is to pick the opposite and ask yourself what you could do that would give you that feeling or get you closer to that feeling. So for example, if the overwhelming or the predominant emotion that you have when it comes to seeking out a new job, for example, is fear, you might ask yourself what the opposite of fear is. And maybe the opposite of fear is a feeling of safety or a feeling of confidence. And so maybe what you would do is to think, okay, well, where or how would I feel confident? Maybe that means reaching out to somebody that you really trust and having a conversation with them about a path that you might choose going forward. If the feeling that you're having is dread, then the opposite of that might be anticipation. So if your job is creating a lot of dread, what is one thing that you could do at work that you would anticipate with joy and excitement? If you feel overwhelmed, then how could you be decisive in a particular way? So maybe it's taking a problem that you have, breaking it down into smaller pieces and being decisive about individual pieces of that larger problem. So really what we're doing here is we're just trying to find microscopic ways of moving you out of that sense of dread or fear or overwhelm or frustration into a feeling that is more positive. So again, just to recap, we talked about how we could address complaining, how we could address opinion shopping, seeking permission, procrastination, and finally managing negative emotions. Now, if you take your stuckness and you approach it in this step-by-step or piece-by-piece framework, it will help you get unstuck because it's breaking down the problem. It's no longer so overwhelming. You can make inroads one step at a time. It will help you have greater awareness about what is actually going on with you. What is actually bothering you? What are you actually feeling? What permission are you really asking for? How much do you already know that you aren't even acknowledging to yourself that you already know? And how are you going to then use that information to move forward? You will also find that this is effective because the more you know about yourself, the easier it is for you to align yourself with your values and the goals that matter to you. Now, to do this exercise and to unstick yourself, it does require that you exercise a number of skills. Number one, you're going to have to get really, really curious about what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're doing, and what you're not doing. You're going to have to hold a great deal of compassion for yourself as you navigate the change. Now, I recorded a podcast episode a few weeks ago about transitions for lawyers. And in that episode, I talked about a change cycle model. It's one that was created by Martha Beck, who is a well-known life coach. And she talks about the different phases of transition. And transition is challenging. It's really hard. The first stage is death and rebirth, and it's about as as challenging and difficult as it sounds. And so give yourself that grace. If you're stuck, really stuck, and you're going to make a change, it may be really hard. It may be that you throw yourself into some very choppy waters. And so give yourself that grace and compassion as you go through the process. You will need to be willing to feel uncomfortable. So if you're stuck, chances are it's because the decision that you're making is not an easy one. If you are thinking about leaving your job, for example, or leaving law, for example, or having difficult conversations, for example, or ending relationships, for example, you are going to have to go through what could be very painful. It's a mourning period. It's a discomfort. And so you need to be willing to actually do that. And so that can be really difficult. You may also need to demonstrate a willingness to take responsibility. So going back to that permission seeking, sometimes it's just so much easier. It feels so much better to ask somebody else to make the decision. And then we do not have to own that decision for ourselves. If it goes terribly wrong, we can say, well, we asked so-and-so and they gave me their opinion and I relied on them and it was a disaster. I'll never ask them for advice again. When we take ownership, when we take responsibility, we don't have that out anymore. And I think to make really, really good, strong decisions, especially when it comes to our professional lives, our personal lives, we really want to own those decisions so that when we make those decisions, regardless of the outcome, number one, we own it, we take responsibility for it. And I'd also invite, if those decisions don't turn out the way that we want, that we can also have compassion for ourselves and understand why we made those decisions, why those decisions were the best decisions, and how even if the decisions don't immediately give us the results that they want, they certainly take us out of the previous discomfort and place us closer to finding the next step, which will ultimately lead us to where we want to go. Finally, it requires a willingness to ask for help if you need it. So I've spoken about these different elements of stuckness in a very individual way about really getting to know yourself and to answer these questions for yourself. I think what it also requires is a willingness to ask for help. So if there's someone out there, whether it's a mentor, whether it's a friend, whether it's a close family member, somebody that you really trust, it can also be a coach, somebody like me. It could be a counselor. It could be really another career counselor. I mean, somebody who you trust, who you can talk to bounce ideas off of, to help yourself move forward. It may be that you need to start forming those relationships. And what can be really powerful there is hearing yourself say out loud to another human being what has been kind of brewing in your mind, in your heart, what is really important to you. When you finally do express what you want using words and you hear yourself speak, you might actually be really surprised at how far in the process you are relative to where you thought you were. Now, when you follow this process, when you address the reasons or the symptoms of being stuck, what you might find in terms of the result that you create is you might end up in a messy situation. You might end up in a really difficult, challenging period where you've decided to move from, maybe it's one set of shoes to the next set of shoes, and you're running around in bare feet and you're running on gravel and the sand is getting hot and, you're invited to events where you need shoes, you don't have them. I'm trying to think of examples, but it can be in the short term messy. But in the longer run, what it allows for you to do is to get unstuck and feel more aligned and ultimately create new situations for yourself where you feel more purposeful, more aligned, more energized, more confident, and like you're moving forward. You're no longer in that stuck, frustrated, fearful energy. You are now in that energy of feeling inspired. You are moving toward the goals that you seek for yourself. You feel that sense of purpose once again. And that ultimately is what it means. That is really the opposite of being stuck. So thank you. Thank you for joining me this week. I hope that what we talked about today resonated with you if you are feeling stuck in particular, and that you have some ideas on how to move forward. Again, I will be having a free webinar on June 15th. It's a Thursday at noon Pacific time. We will be talking about forward-looking goals. So thinking about how you can spend the balance of 2023 focused on what it is that you're trying to create. So if you're stuck, this might be a great webinar for you to attend. And if you have questions, if you'd like any help, please do feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out by email, on LinkedIn. There's lots of places that you can find me. And I just wanted to thank you again for joining me here this week and for joining me every week. It is such a pleasure and a privilege to have this chance to connect with you. And I just want to let you know how much I appreciate having you in my practice. So thank you so much. And I'll look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.